Alright, so currently if you see there is no API listed here. Okay, but whenever we will create our API, then we will see available APIs list here. So let's try to deploy our created Lambda function that will create this API. And in case if you are wondering, are we going to create this API manually or not? So we don't have to create this API manually. Reason being, this serverless YML file. So whenever we deploy our created Lambda using serverless deploy command, at that time it goes through cloud formation, where cloud formation creates required resources for our Lambda function. So in this case, since we have mentioned inside the events that we want HTTP API, so it will look whether this API exists or not, and if this API does not exist or this route does not exist, it will create it for us. So this is how the things works in serverless, which is very interesting. So yeah, let me just show you how this works. I need to traverse up to this folder. And here we will write deploy command. So deploy command is simple, serverless deploy, and this command will deploy the functions that exist in the current directory. So yeah, let's hit that. All right, it is going through the cloud formation. If you see, it is trying to, now it is going through cloud formation again. So that means a command is working now. So let's wait until this completes and then we will see our created resources. Well, meanwhile, while this command is in progress, so let's have a look into our serverless.yml file and let's see how this command will work. So CloudFormation will check our serverless.yml file and it will check resources that is required to complete this entire setup. So our setup is quite simple. We have this service which name is HTTP API. Then we have framework version 3. Then we have provider. So since we know that serverless package supports multiple providers, so we need to mention our provider. So since we are trying to create Lambda and Lambda is AWS service, so we'll have to mention our service name first. So we'll have to mention our provider name. Okay, if you are using any other cloud provider other than AWS, you'll have to mention that here. Then we have a runtime. Since we have project in Node.js, we'll keep Node.js as a compiler. Then inside these functions, we have function name and then we have a handler. So handler is nothing but, so this handler defines what will happen if this function get triggered. So this handler name is made up of two things. First is the file name. So in our case, it is index.js file. So this file name is index. And then inside the index, we'll have to mention this function name. So if you see this index.js file, we have this handler function. So whenever we try to trigger or invoke this Lambda function, it will search for this file name and it will call this function. Then after that, we have events. Now this is important. So since we are trying to create HTTP API, I have mentioned events as HTTP API. Now I have already mentioned that there are different types of events that we can mention here. So there is HTTP API, there is REST API, then there are ActiveMQ, IoT, S3, and there is a lot of different types of events we can define. So since we are working on HTTP, okay, since we are trying to create HTTP API, so this is the syntax that we need to follow. So this syntax has three main important things. First is we'll have to mention our event name, which is HTTP API. Then we'll have to mention the path that we want to configure for our API, and then the method. There are 4 different types of method you can define. First is get, or else you can use post, or else you can use put, or else you can use delete. Okay, so it depends on what type of API you are trying to create. You can mention your method name here, which is similar to REST API. Now once this configuration is done, we will run deploy command. Now this deploy command will try to create resources, which in our case we require HTTP API. So this will try to create new AWS API gateway. Cloud formation command will automatically try to create one HTTP API. Alright guys, so our deploy command completed successfully and you can see the results. So we received one URL which is our API. Now our API is ready. Okay, once we call this API, our Lambda function will automatically get invoked and it will return intended results. So let's try this out. But before we actually try this, let me actually show you how these things is formed. So if I refresh this API gateway tab, now we will see there is a list of API. Okay, so this API automatically got created by Cloud Formation, and if I show you, this is the URL and this is the exact same URL that we saw in the CMD, and we can use this URL to fetch our data. So let me copy this, and in order to test this URL, let's use Postman. Simply search for Postman. Well, for those who don't know what is Postman, Postman is a tool that helps you testing your API. So this is really simple. Let's go to sign in. Well, you will have to sign in order to test it, but it is easy. You can simply use Google sign in. Now inside of it, you'll have to go and create new workspace. Let's give it a name. Let's say demo test. All right, now let's create new workspace. Click on next, give it a name, demo API, or you can give any name. Either you want to use team, public. I'll select personal and let's create it. All right, so now our setup is ready. Like we can simply test our API. So click on this plus button, which is add button, and it will give you this tab. Now here you can select the method type and make sure that you will select exact same type that you have mentioned here. Okay, and after that you will have to provide your URL, and you have to provide this URL which you got in CMD. So either you can use this, or if you forgot this, you can go to API gateway and select the created API, and then you can find it here. Okay, and if you are not sure about the routes, you have to choose this routes section and you can find your route as well. Okay, so this is how you can complete your API, so which is this. Now let me click on send. So here we received message from our Lambda function. So if you see this Go Serverless 3.0, this is the message that we have inside our serverless. So let me quickly change this just to show you this is working fine. So I'll say demo message from Lambda, right? And let me go back to terminal. Let me deploy this. So now I'm not going to go through entire cloud formation process. I'll simply use serverless deploy, and then I'll have to mention function name. So function name in my case is API demo. So I'll paste it here. And the reason why I'm deploying by specifying this function name is because I want to speed up this deployment process. Otherwise, if I just use serverless deploy, it will again go through entire cloud formation process, which I don't want. All right, so deployment is complete. Now let's test our API once again. We click here. Now you see we have our changed message. So this is how you can create first ever basic API using Amazon API Gateway, serverless, and Lambda function. All right, in our upcoming videos, we will try to add more functionalities in this API. So stay tuned.